This is the Everyday Fray podcast, hosted by Michael Howie.
Hi, friend. This is Michael Howie for the Everyday Fray podcast. And I want to start out with an apology. I started this project in the spring, wanting to do an episode every week. And I wanted to base it on the interview style that I had been doing with my other podcast, Defender Radio. And without having the backing of the large nonprofit and the 4 years worth of podcast, it's been somewhat difficult arranging interviews on subjects I wanted to talk about. So it frequently got put off. It's also been a little quiet lately. Things are going well in my life. I've been in a group CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy program, and that's been a wonderful experience. Things are happy at home. I've been busy with work. Things are good. As a result, my thoughts about mental health tend to get limited to notes in a notebook. My moleskin that I always keep with me is half full, largely of things about mental health, but it hasn't really been enough to evolve into doing a full podcast episode or doing large blogs. But part of my cognitive behavioral therapy group is looking at the intolerance of uncertainty. And I'm no authority on this, but my understanding is that it's a part of having an anxiety disorder, is that intolerance of uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen. And one of the things we've been working on, and I feel I've personally done quite well with, is exposure therapy. My first day was sitting with my back to a room full of people and not turning around when I heard things, not looking to see what the sounds were. And that went, it was hard, but it happened. It worked. I went through my checklist of all of the primary exposures that I need to work on. And some of the more difficult ones I feel I was very successful about. And I'm actually going to do, I think, a blog about that, maybe a podcast. But talking about the experience of going through an exposure therapy part of the program and how that all worked out for me. One of the things on that list, though, is unscripted speaking. So you may not know this, but when I do a podcast, whether it's Everyday Fray podcast that you're listening to right now or my other one, Defender Radio, I typically script out the entire intro and outro. So that's before the interview and after the interview. I've written out exactly what I want to say. There is a bit of ad-libbing, when I read something through and it doesn't quite sound right, or I think of something funny to add to it, and I'll just sort of throw that in casually. But it's never just sit down and talk. The interviews are. Those are entirely unscripted. I just have a few notes about what I want to talk about, but I don't read from it. So today, as part of my ongoing exposure, as part of my efforts to do more with what I have, I'm going to record a podcast with just a few notes. Now, to be fair, it's actually 2 pages of notes, but about a quarter of a page is a song lyric, and we'll get to that. So today, I was downloading albums and making a playlist. One was mostly stuff from the early 90s, or sorry, not the early 90s, from the 90s and the early millennium. And as I was driving home, Everclear's Learning How to Smile came on. And this is, it was it was horrible to drive, but it was a gorgeous August thunderstorm. And while that album didn't tell my story, and didn't really necessarily relate to my story at the time, it was perhaps the soundtrack to that summer. Now, 17 years ago, and by 17 years ago, I mean literally 17 years ago in about 3 weeks, Songs from an American Movie, Volume 1, Learning How to Smile, came out. Everclear was one of my favorite bands. They still are. And the first songs I learned to play by tab music on the guitar were from Everclear's prior album, Sparkle and Fade. And why this album in particular is significant, though, is it came out during my summer that I was inside. I don't know what to call it. I've often called it, when I was sick, just for the sake of having something to call it. I've called it a breakdown. I've called it when my anxiety peaked. More or less, it was when I was 18 and my anxiety peaked. I had quickly evolved a type of agoraphobia. Depression set in. I mentioned it in my first episode of this podcast, and I've written about it, but I don't often go into detail on what happened. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So prior to that summer, in the spring, I started feeling sick when I was out with friends. They may remember me having flashes of maybe a bit of stomach flu or cramps or just generally feeling unwell. And it was after a somewhat momentous week. My grandfather had died. High school and I decided to take a break, and a bunch of my family was leaving the area for a wedding. I developed a bit of a flu. I had a temperature, I didn't feel well, and I stayed home. And after a few days, I tried going outside, sneak down the street to the park for a cigarette or go out and see some friends. And pretty much as soon as I got past the front door, I immediately feel sick. And when I say sick, it was, my heart would be racing. I'd have trouble breathing. My stomach would be in knots. And at the same time, flopping around. It was truly a terrifying feeling. And what was most terrifying was not knowing what it was. But it was every time I'd leave, every time I'd go outside, this swell of feeling of illness would just burn up inside me. And I stopped going outside. As a result, I was living in my parents' basement at the time, and I had everything I would need except for a kitchen down there. I'd be, staying up until 6 a.m. playing MUDs. Those are text-based video games, as well as other video games. It was in the early days of Napster, another file-sharing software, so I'd be downloading music and episodes. I'd be awake for 20 to 24 hours and then sleep for 12 to 15. I wouldn't eat anything for almost an entire day, and then I'd gorge on unhealthy food. I watched all 50 hours and 15 minutes of Due South in a 72-hour period. I think it's safe to say that my self-care simply went out the window. Now, it may be my memory and my writer's mind playing a bit of tricks on me, but I remember the pot lights in this room. So it was actually an office originally in the basement that became my bedroom when we moved into this house. And I had 2 rows of pot lights, and they were along the ceiling and almost against the wall, and they'd cast these really deep, contrasty shadows. They were very harsh edges in the corners and edges of the room. Retrospectively, in my memory, it is both sinister and lonely the way those lights looked. During that time, I lost a lot of relationships, a lot of friendships, and I became highly isolated. I spent so much time alone that it became normal. Now, around that time, as I said, I believe it was early July of 2000. Everclear's latest album came out. And for a limited time at HMV, and you may or may not remember that place depending on your age, the album was being sold with a bonus disc of acoustic live tracks. That included some of my favorite songs. Santa Monica obviously was one of them. They had American Girl on there. It was a great disc. I begged my mom to buy it for me. And because she was such a wonderful, supportive mother, and still is, she did. I distinctly remember the slipcover for the bonus disc being an orangey red frowny face on a black background. It might have been the same as the cover art for the wonderful single, but it spoke a great deal to me at the moment when I saw that. I don't think music itself speaks to me the way it does for some people. Art Alexakis, the singer and songwriter for Everclear, is 20 years my senior and has lived a vastly different life than my own sheltered suburban one. But his music would paint pictures that I could clearly see, and the emotion of some of those tracks on that album were reflective of the emotion or state of mind that I felt I was in, that I was experiencing. And that's based on my interpretation of these lyrics. On that album was Wonderful, a song about wanting things to be simple and happy, maybe as they once were, and rejecting the falseness of being told that everything's okay, everything's wonderful. Here We Go Again. It was about a relationship with someone following a life of potentially poor choices, and the proud happiness that could be found in a simple, bare bones, loving, and charged relationship. And Song from an American Movie, Part 1. It was a very brief song that later became a full track in another album. Had 2 wonderful lines in it that I really enjoyed. The only thing that ever made sense to me is the words to a song from an American movie. At the time, that felt intensely appropriate. I was learning a lot, I think, about who I was, and I was delving into my own emotions and, on the healthy levels of introspection, realistically, but this song just felt very intensely appropriate. But there was one song, and it's one that stuck with me, and it brings me back to that summer, is Learning How to Smile. I'm not going to read the lyrics in their entirety, and I can't play the music on the podcast without being sued for like $1 jillion that I don't have. So I encourage you to go stream or download the track yourself. Again, that's Learning How to Smile from Songs from an American Movie, Volume 1 by Everclear. The song's essence is about a couple who are struggling through life with all of its ups and downs, notable failures, and the connection they share that holds them together. A few of the lines that stuck out include, "You say there is no perfect place. I say I know this is true. We're just learning how to smile, and that's not easy to do." And the bridge to the song, when I hear it, not when I read it out loud in a quiet room with a microphone, but listening to this song, both the original and the re-record of it, this line still gives me shivers. "Yes, I know there ain't no finish line. I know this never ends. We are learning how to fall and climb back up again." I know it's not Shakespeare, but in the moments, in that summer, it meant a lot to me. This song was a mid-track of an album that never got released as a single and was written about a relationship from someone much older than myself with significantly different experiences. But for me, in that moment, it was a song about hope. I listened to it over and over and over again. When I felt like there wasn't any point or that things were getting too hard, I listened to it. When I didn't know how to get out of the dark place I was in, I listened to it. And on an overcast September day, when the wind had turned cool but it was still clammy, and I walked to the store for the first time by myself without an anxiety attack or depression-laden thoughts, I listened to it again. Now, between that September day and now, I went to college. I got married and I got divorced. I began a successful, award-speckled career. I fell in love and had my heart broken an appropriate number of times. I left that career to do what I love for a cause I believe in. I got married again and figured out how little I know about the world. Throughout that time, I'd listen to this song by Everclear. I'd think about how hard I'd worked, how much I'd succeeded, and how much I'd failed in trying to learn how to smile. I'd wonder if I'd ever fall back to that place. And if I did, I'd question whether or not I'd be able to claw my way back out. And now, on days like this, after an afternoon of rain, I realize at some point that that storm has passed. And I smile. I hope to tell you more of my story and more of my experiences as we move forward in this podcast, and do intend to keep trying to get more interviews for you. I'd love to hear about music that has meant something to you, that has changed you in some way, or has been a theme song, a rallying cry, or even the song that you listen to when you just need to have a cry. Let me know on Twitter at Everyday Freight Podcast, on Facebook at Everyday Freight Podcast, or on Instagram at Everyday Podcast. If you want, you can shoot me an email. It's Michael at everydayfreightpodcast.com, or you can comment on this podcast's blog at everydayfreightpodcast.com. I'm Michael Howie, and this is the Everyday Freight Podcast. This is my journey, and it's far from over.